just wanted to reintroduce, we met once a long time ago. I'm Mark Douglas. I'll be a couple people over from you, but I'm excited that you're here. Looking forward to being on this panel with you. We are.
Okay, so the chair members are next to me. So just really like to go to speak. You had it back there.
Are you giving instructions?
Kind of. So you just have to share this mic with
Lyle?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just swap back and forth.
We can do that. Hey man.
How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Good.
You got your place all reserved up here.
Yes. Dr. Dube, Carlos Cardosa, it's a pleasure to meet you face to face. Though I'm not up here. I teach what to study.
Thank you.
Pleasure to
Gusto. Yeah. Because among us, you're the furthest to the left, sir.
Mark, just want to say hello, Richard Allen Farmer.
Hey,
here.
Richard, good to see you. Did you see Lindsay? She's sitting or standing somewhere about somewhere in the middle, about halfway back on the right side.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Hello, my brother. How are you doing?
Okay, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see
Yeah,
Catherine.
currently,
Bishop Howard, Pastor 15th Street Presbyterian Church, first and oldest African American capital.
Excellent.
Unless you're on something.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Nice little picture.
So real quick, so on the mics, all your mics have just a mic and a mute switch. So if you're getting like a lot of noise when you're not up, you can just hit it to mute. Otherwise, you can just leave it on.
But if we do,
It should be good.
this is how it's gonna work.
Yeah. So just make if you're speaking and you don't hear yourself, check
Right to
the
this
mic first.
iPad.
Either way, as long as just remember to switch it back.
That's all it'll be. So it'll come right to you.
I am kind of in the introduction state that can I look at the camera and say that those who are looking to have questions, you can do so.
Sure.
Just want to leave this on mute,
Yeah, and then
when you go to
when you
speak.
say that, I have a slide that'll go just to the live stream. It won't go here. But I'll put that on the live stream so that those folks can see. There's like a number that they text in, kind of thing. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks so much.
And so I think you two will be sharing this mic, right?
Okay, you're good.
So just leave it on mute, and then you can just make sure when you're speaking, just to put it on mic.
Okay.
Just make sure we don't get extra noise. So thanks. And yours doesn't have it, so don't worry about it. Yours is the only one with no mute switch. Don't worry about it. It's always on. Let me go make sure this is on. Here's their mic. It'll work. You don't have to worry about pressing any buttons. This is all good. So, yeah, I'll unmute you when it's time for you to go.
So I'm going to have to be manually switching the slides in the back. So if you'll just say next or whatever, I'll do it. So thank you.
Some people are still using restrooms.
Doug. How are you? That's excellent. Literally right in front.
It's a little bit late, Howell, to check me at this point. I've got 20-some years now because of you. You could have done it a long time ago.
And Clay just said you were looking for me? Oh, okay, good. I'm like, I feel very awkward walking up here right now. Does anybody need anything? Well, we're at it.
Welcome.
Okay, good. Okay. Enjoy.
I think we should get started. Yeah. One of the presenters is using, Lyle is using PowerPoint slides, and the tech people know that. So if you're doing it alphabetically, at what point is she coming in? Fifth person. I'll let the tech people know.
That's right. Friends, testing. Friends, good evening. We wish to begin our inauguration symposium and invite all to please take your seats. Friends, we are grateful this evening to have gathered a cohort of leaders to participate and as well contribute to our symposium emphasis on forming Christian leaders for an endemic era. Before reading the description or sharing what we will be having conversations today, it is an honor to introduce those who are here with us. We have here Dr. Frank Yamada, who is the Executive Director at the Association of Theological Schools. Dr. Yamada, welcome. Dr. Persavia Prelo, pastor at 15th Street Presbyterian Church and Director of Contextual Theology at the Howard University School of Divinity. Dr. Prelo, we welcome you. Dr. Carlos Caldosa Orlandi, who is the Frederick E. Roach Professor of World Christianity at Baylor University. Carlos, we welcome you. Dr. Musa Dube, who is the William Ragsdale Cannon Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Candler School of Theology and President of the Society of Biblical Literature. We welcome you. Dr. Mark Douglas, who is a professor of Christian ethics here at Columbia Theological Seminary. Mark, welcome. The Reverend Lyle Gwynn Garrity, who is a creative director of Sanctified Art. We welcome you, Lyle. And Dr. Justo Gonzalez, author, theologian, and professor of church history. Dr. Gonzalez, we welcome you. Friends, in a world of economic stress, national political conflict, gun violence, war, and traumas caused by the pandemics, the church and theological schools are navigating a period of uncertainty. What needs to be said and heard in this endemic time? What approaches should seminaries explore to form impactful leaders who can address the challenges of our time effectively? Our complex realities call for robust and truth-telling conversations, not oversimplification or nostalgia about theological institutions and their engagement with faith, communities, and the public square. These panelists here, which we are honored to welcome on this dais of this Inauguration Symposium, represent a broad spectrum of disciplines as we seek to create a platform for intentional dialogue and praxis. And at this moment, I would like to invite the Dr. Carlos Cardoza Orlandi, the Frederick E. Roach Professor of World Christianity from Baylor University, to begin our conversations today.
Good evening. This is a special weekend for me. My friend and colleague Victor, President Aloyo, will be inaugurated as the 11th president of Columbia Theological Seminary. Victor, you know how we Caribbeans think. I am so glad that you're not the 13th president, because that number is very dangerous. Yet you will be inaugurated as the 11th president. You know, 11 is a good number. In one of our Afro-diaspora religions, 11 is the number of Ibeji, the sacred female twins. The story goes that Ibeji blesses with gozo y abundancia, joy and abundance. The Cuban version of their stories refers to their power through the beating of drums. These twin female spirits drove away the devil and brought happiness and abundance. Again, I'm so glad that you're not number 13th, but you're number 11. I'm delighted to be among these distinguished colleagues and the CTS family. Lizzie and I will always be grateful for the wonderful years of living in Decatur. I will always be grateful for the supportive platform that Columbia gave me, the opportunity to begin my vocation as a theological educator, and the many lessons and experiences that continue to shape my life as a theological educator. Thank you, Victor, for this opportunity. As many as you know, I teach in a department of religion. For the last 5 years, I have been having so much fun teaching undergraduate students. At Baylor, we have over 150 students completing a major in religion and almost the same number doing a minor, which is very unique for the situations of Department of Religions in the United States and in Europe. Our student population is quite diverse. In every single undergraduate course I have taught, The majority of the students are females. 3 to 4 students are persons of color, Asian Americans, Latinx, African American. In my years as a theological educator in the US, Baylor has provided me the most diverse teaching context. Baylor, not the theological schools where I taught, Baylor. I also had the unique experience of having one Hindu and one Muslim student in my Christian mission class. It was such a trip. Given the topic that President Aloyo selected, I decided to do an informal survey, emailing some of my undergraduate students, those potential students to continue graduate theological and professional education. I asked them to write a short statement describing 1 or 2 characteristics of an impactful leader who can address the challenges of our time effectively, and what kind of training should they receive in order to develop a robust and truth-telling skills for engagement with faith communities and the public square. That was your question, right, man?
Yes.
Quite a challenging task for undergraduate students, I would say. First, with one exception, I received replies from my female students. And more than half were young women of color. What follows are some of their very insightful contributions that they offer to our conversation. First, and I quote, "Leaders need to respond to controversial and polarizing issues with respect, yet grounded in religious, personal truth and convictions. Second, leaders need to be trained in a long view of Christian history and spiritual disciplines that will help them resist the temptation to bend their knees to the tyrant of the urgent. They need to learn from the wisdom of Christian history and develop skills for shepherding over against church growth based on corporate profit." There's a future, right? Third, leaders need to be sensitive to other people's world of interpretations. Leaders need to recognize that the communities do not fit the black-white binary of interpretations, but communities are complex, and such complexities requires special training. And finally, leaders who avoid discussion while offering prayer and empathy create isolation. Inaction speaks loudly of indifference, and our generation needs to see action from the church. These comments represent an agenda for graduate and professional theological education and formation. I share with you what a group of undergraduate students, deeply committed young Christians seeking to be leaders in Christian communities, long for in theological and in ministerial formation. Proverbs 29:18 states, where there's no vision, what? A people perish. Yet there is a vision. Young students who will be our future Christian leaders are demanding theological formation that is grounded in the needs, dreams, and visions that emerge from the interaction of the gospel with their context. It seems to me that the challenge is not a lack of vision. I don't think it's a lack of vision, but rather the incoherent action and execution from theological institutions given their student and congregational constituency. As I conclude, allow me to share an example of this incoherent action and execution. A mainline affluent congregation in an urban center is moved to engage with its immediate community. The leaders of the congregation wisely organize town hall meetings and paid for professional sociological study to explore the needs and dreams of the community. There were concerns about the outcomes of the assessment, given that the congregation had been quite isolated from its immediate context. Yet, surprisingly, the community responded to the town halls and surveys and named its need and dream. We need a job training center for our youth. To make the story short, the congregation decided to invest in the creation of a counseling center, which it did not last more than 3 years. Why would a congregation invest so much money to discover the needs and dreams of a community and then take a different direction? Missionally, why would a congregation see God's plan for its community, invest in the community, move by the gospel, and discover God leading them in unexpected ways to ultimately deny the need, to deny the vision, to deny the dream of the community? Why the incoherent action? Is there something about our theological formation that facilitates incoherent actions? I invite all of us to explore the whys of this incoherent action and execution between theological educations and our Christian communities. Empathy is meaningless when our communities experience our incoherence and impose agendas for their context. I never thought that CTS would be in such a unique position. With a rich, reformed, ecumenical grounding, this institution is challenged to coherently address the formation of Christian students who are very different from the students I used to teach 12 years ago. I would have never imagined for CTS to look like this. Moreover, in the last few years that I have been invited to serve as a trustee, I'm glad to hear leaders of CTS strongly state that we need to open the table. We need to invite others to the table. I want to encourage us and challenge CTS not only to invite others to the table, but also ask those others to bring their food to the table. Let's have some tacos and enchiladas. Let's have some kimchi red rice cakes. Let's have some soul food. Let's have some crab and kalaloo. Let's have some falafel. And you can just keep on naming the food that we should bring. So with that, those words, I conclude by quoting a Chinese sage. Actually, the second most important Chinese sage in Confucian thought. He says, "The ancients who wish to manifest their clear character to the world would first bring order to their states. Those who wish to bring order to their states would first regulate their families. Those who wish to regulate their families would first cultivate their personal lives. Those who wish to cultivate their personal lives would first rectify their minds. Those who wish to rectify their minds would first make their wills sincere. Those who wish to make their wills sincere would first extend their knowledge. The extension of knowledge consists in the investigation of all things. When things are investigated, knowledge is extended. When knowledge is extended, the will becomes sincere. When the will is sincere, the mind is rectified. When the mind is rectified, the personal life is cultivated. When the personal life is cultivated, the family will be regulated. And when the family is regulated, the state will be in order. This is a 4th century BCE scholar. And when the state is in order, and when Colombia will be in order, given its new change, there might be, and I hope there will be, peace in the context. Thank you.
Dr. Cardosa Orlandi, thank you so much for the opportunity and as well to have the contribution of your class in responding to that question and the rich elements that you have provided for us to examine and to explore. Incoherency is what we need to tackle. And so thank you so much. Friends, before I introduce our next panelist, I do want to mention those who are following online that we are also having the opportunity for you to respond with questions. And so please feel free to ask questions and we will make sure that we will respond and make them known. At this time, I'd like to as well introduce my colleague and friend and just grateful for his presence with us, Dr. Mark Douglas, Professor of Christian Ethics at Columbia Theological Seminary. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. This is an intimidating room. As I look around, I see more intellectual horsepower gathered in this space than any time I can remember, since I happen to see Catherine and Justo and Walter Brueggemann sitting alone in this room having a conversation. The topic also is intimidating. Forming Christian leaders during a pandemic. That might have been a more obvious topic if a bit on the nose. But no, like a Jacob deGrom slider, President Loyo's endemic pitch came with way more movement on it than a simple pandemic fastball. Incidentally, that's the last pro-Mets illustration you get, Professor Oloyo. You're in Braves country now. Pandemics hit hard and go away. They manifest in occasionality and disruption. Endemics stick around, multiplying on each other, driving us to constantly renegotiate the very changes that they're forcing upon us, to modify our plans, adjust our hopes, and reframe our practices. To speak on forming Christian leaders for an endemic era, then, is to speak of attending to those evolving forces that are with us for the foreseeable future, demanding that we modify our teaching plans, adjust our vocational hopes, and reframe our ecclesial practices. What might forming Christian leaders during an endemic era look like? An obvious starting point is that endemics force us to roll up our sleeves, to get revaccinated each year because, like that endemic influenza virus, endemic forces in the church and in wider society mutate just enough that one shot isn't enough. Forming Christian leaders can't be structured around a single 3-year MDiv dose, and can't be confined only to persons on their way to becoming professional Christians, paid by the church to run its business. We will need to give greater attention not only to students who hold jobs while going to seminary, but to ministers who hold jobs while serving the church. Christian leadership in an endemic era is a lifelong project that catches up the whole body of Christ. And we should keep our sleeves rolled up. There are increasingly powerful authoritarian and technocratic movements in the United States that would deny not only the value of higher education in the humanities, but also the wisdom of pursuing any type of ministry grounded in obligations to love a God bigger than our biases and to love neighbors other than those who look, act, and think like us. At least in the North Atlantic, those of us with the privilege to teach the humanities in institutions of higher education are in a knife fight for legitimacy. And the only reason I can think that we theological educators are not alert to this fact is that we have been allowed to coast on the accommodations provided for the mainline church under the illusions of its non-threateningness and cultural centrality. But the church isn't meant to be non-threatening. It isn't at the center of U.S. culture, and it, too, is imperiled by authoritarian and technocratic movements. If we want students trained to think, if we want graduates capable of defending democratic and humane practices, if we want a church that is relevant, we need to be in that fight. Paradoxically, students from around the world are seeking desperately to come to the U.S. to study, because regardless of our many national flaws, higher education in the U.S. is still seen as the gold standard. My classes this fall include a student from Syria who grew up in a town surrounded by Islamic State forces cut off from basic goods like food and water. An Orthodox priest from the Republic of Georgia watching from a distance as Ukrainian refugees and young Russian men fleeing the draft have attempted to enter his country. And a student holding poetry slams in Madagascar in the hopes of raising enough money to come here to study because she can't rely on the internet there. And these are just a few of my students. All of which raise complicated and increasingly pressing questions. Theological education in North America is undergoing a period of dramatic churn. And its future for those of us forming Christian leaders is going to mandate the selection of our courses, the patterns of our pedagogies, and the foci of our scholarship will turn on some complicated and at times grief-causing decisions as we respond to the church's marginalization in the North Atlantic and its explosion elsewhere. Rather than adoring ivory tower offices filled with soft lamplight, we must join our professional academic work to public activism. Rather than mouthing simplified mantras like listen for silenced voices and idealized truisms like God's preferential option is for the poor, our pedagogies must confront the objectification of romanticized others and engage our neighbors as we find them in all their graceful and sinful complexity. Rather than projecting a vision of seminaries as places of refuge, framed by myths of womb-like community, we need to encounter each other as adults, called to hard and wondrous tasks in politically complicated and morally fraught places, and doing so involves rolling up our sleeves. While our sleeves are rolled up, we should dig our hands into the dirt. We have entered a period in which our relationship with the non-human natural world will define all life on Earth. Air pollution is a leading cause of death worldwide. Animal species populations have diminished by over 2/3 in the last 50 years, and we're at somewhere around 100 times the natural background rate of extinction for all species. There's more carbon dioxide in the air than at any point in the last 800,000 years, which combined with other greenhouse gases has led to more massive droughts, fires, floods, storms than at any point in recorded history. Melting ice caps could raise the sea levels by 6 feet before someone born today is likely to die, which rising seas could displace over 200 million people. And since I started speaking, we've lost the equivalent of 80 football fields worth of rainforest trees. Any church that claims the centrality of Matthew 25 better figure out how that chapter matters in an age of environmental concern. And any seminary that doesn't foreground these concerns is committing pedagogical malpractice, especially since the deleterious effects of all these forces are unequally distributed among both human populations and global species. Philosopher Olufemi Taiwo has argued that the impacts of these events, framed within what he refers to as a global racial empire, have been and will be most dramatically felt by those who have already been most victimized by colonizing projects, overwhelmingly black and brown peoples and indigenous non-human species. So any attempt at pursuing tikkun olam, the repair of the world, will mandate pursuing projects of reparative justice as part of formation during an endemic era. Around here, beyond pointing to LEED Gold certified buildings, beyond maintaining a marginal partnership with global growers, beyond offering occasional conferences or courses on environmental justice, such formation would involve rapidly divesting our endowment from fossil fuel-related corporations, shifting our own sizable energy footprint downward and toward renewables, making sure every course we teach attends to and is informed by climate science, knowing the ecological context from which our students come, and keeping a copy of Bill Brown's Climate Chaos, a pedagogical manifesto, pinned above our computers for reference. Or said differently, we need to dig our hands in the dirt. Finally, we need to learn to live with dirty hands and form Christian leaders who can do the same. The modern theological project has been framed by attempts to avoid defilement in the pursuit of purity and in avoidance of complicity. We have mouthed illusory maxims like, the church should be an alternative polis, a community of resident aliens. We have leaned into the First Amendment separation of church and state as a way of avoiding schismatic impulses. We have defended the ways of nonviolence as above reproach and incapable of being weaponized toward divisiveness. We have treated DEI initiatives as curatives for deep and long-standing systems of racial, patriarchal, heteronormative, and ableist injustice. And we have treated the failures of those same initiatives as signs that some of us just weren't trying hard enough. We've put theology in the service of therapy in the hope that we can form healthy people to lead healthy churches. We have, in short, sought to cure ourselves from all that ails us. I am not saying, to be clear, that we should simply accept dirty hands, throwing them up in the air and surrender. Should we go on sinning that grace may increase? Me genoito, by no means. The church does have a role to play in society. Schisms carry harms. The coercive use of force is always morally troubling. Initiatives that reduce historic injustice and ongoing harm warrant our attention, and it is far better to address psychopathologies within theological education than to allow them to fester later in church leadership. Instead, I am saying that dealing with such matters means letting go of the endlessly wearying and metabolically wasteful projects of pursuing antiseptic cleanliness. We must learn how to negotiate the inevitable complicities that come with living while endemics interact, and when responsibly addressing one endemic usually means exacerbating another. We need to imagine the practices of justice as carrying costs that are not fairly distributed, the pursuit of justice as not synonymous with claims of righteousness, and at least this side of eternity, the consequences of just actions as neither perfect nor complete. We need to recognize that the manufacturing of discontent over local imperfections has become an escape from dealing with a world of outrages. We need to be less selective in our compassion and more profligate in our forgiving. And we need to link our hopes to the actual conditions within which most people, with most creatures on this planet live. As Bell Hooks reminds us, to be truly visionary, we have to root our imagination in our concrete reality, while simultaneously imagining possibilities beyond that reality. And this is learning to live with dirty hands. So roll up our sleeves, dig our hands into the dirt, and learn to live with dirty hands. Of these things, I think, does the formation of Christian leaders during an endemic era consist. Given the incalculable, inequitable, and seemingly insurmountable costs of living in a conflicted, cheapened, and commodified world, hope in the possibilities and power of a theological education may feel quixotic. But surely it is better to tilt at windmills than to beat our lances into lampstands or our syringes into knitting needles.
Dr. Douglas, thank you so much for providing us with a depth and wealth of information and challenges. For me, a takeaway that I've heard is that the church is not meant to be non-threatening, that we need to be able to dig into the dirt and to be able to dirty our hands. We cannot be complicit. And there's much more that we can unpack from that statement and from your presentation, of which I'm grateful. Thank you. At this moment, we have Dr. Musa Dube, who is the William Ragsdale Cannon Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Candler School of Theology. Dr. Dube, welcome.
Thank you for having me. In 1997, I was a freshly graduated student of the New Testament when I entered the lecture halls of the University of Botswana. I was excited and armed with all classic and newest ways of reading the Bible. I was all ready to make my mark in the world of teaching, researching, and community service. But I soon came to realize that I had landed in a country, region, and world that was overshadowed by something else: the global HIV and AIDS pandemic. As I stood in the lecture theater, packed full with 250 students who had come to learn gospel narratives at my feet, I soon found myself unnerved, disenchanted, as I began to ask myself, what is the point of training the students about ancient contexts of the gospel and methods of reading the gospel if the knowledge I impart cannot save their lives and the lives of their families? Why should I teach the New Testament if it cannot address the pandemic that is engulfing the world? I had crisis, career crisis. Infection rate among the young and sexually active population of my country at the time placed it at 33%. There was no queue and no access to affordable treatment. The song we were singing then was ABC, namely that preventing HIV/AIDS was as easy as abstaining, being faithful to one's partner, and condomizing. But no, handling HIV/AIDS epidemic was not as easy as ABC. Death reigned and recklessly struck us, and many of my students disappeared, either through death, grief, or assuming new roles as heads of the families. Recently, it has been creeping on me again. I am haunted by the relevance of my career as I watch our earthly home fall apart. Mother Earth weeps. She breaks apart, cracks, melts, and flows, closing boundaries between seas, rivers, dams, and the ground. She rages with frequent and more vicious hurricanes and destructive storms. She unleashes heat, waves, and bends, setting up endless storms. She releases hailstorm, hitting the ground, animals, plants, human beings, and everything on the way. Mother Earth weeps. Mother Earth laments from all the corners of her body, and we are witnesses. I begin to wrestle with myself and how I should be teaching biblical studies in the context of the lamentations of Mother Earth and her children. Does God hear the cry of the earth? I am at the crossroads again. What is the relevance of my New Testament career if it cannot be part of healing and saving Mother Earth? I believe that the contemporary Earth crisis calls for the highest reflection and action from all Christian thinkers, writers, prophets, trainers, leaders. We need to ask, what constitutes good news to the earth and the whole earth community? We need to ask, how have we proclaimed the good news, and how should we be preaching the good news to the earth and her children? We need to ask, how have we understood sin, and how should we rethink our understanding of sin in the context of earth crisis? We need to ask, how did we understand the mission of God, and how should we rethink God's mission in the context of the earth crisis? We need to ask, how did we define salvation? And how do we need to redefine salvation today as we work within the painful lamentations of Mother Earth? We need to ask, who is Christ? Who is the Savior in this context? We need to ask, what is the church and how must we worship God in the midst of the lamentations of Mother Earth? Needless to say, we need to birth Christian leaders who will think and work through Mother Earth as we realize that God weeps with the earth. We need to train Christian leaders who will weep with Mother Earth as they interrogate the sins that we have worked upon her body, and the Spirit of God that was there upon all creation from the beginning. We need to train Christian leaders who will carry the lamentations of Mother Earth as they assume their prophetic roles on the mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, forests, villages, towns, and cities. We need to train Christian leaders who will stand and with the poor and the marginalized as they once more become the hardest hit from the destruction of Mother Earth. Curriculum transformation is in order. I arrived in this city during COVID-19 last year. We were still masked and reeling in another pandemic. We were still working from home, and COVID-19 had forced us to retreat, cover up, and stay in our houses and give the earth a Sabbath. Yet it was during the COVID-19 when the whole world came to graphically witness George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," and watch him die, thereby unmasking the suffocating pandemic of racism. Now that we have been unmasked, what have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, and how should we think theologically through and with COVID-19 experience and its link with class, gender, race, and age? What is the link between HIV/AIDS, Earth crisis, and COVID-19? It is fair to say that, among others, we have learned, and we continue to learn, that colonialism is a pandemic. Capitalism is a pandemic. Neoliberalism is a pandemic. Patriarchy is a pandemic. Racism is a pandemic. Anthropocentrism is a pandemic. Homophobia is a pandemic. Theological training should be in the business of training God's foot soldiers, those who weep with the violated Spirit of God in all creation, those who carry the mantle of the prophets, those who lament in the public square, those who carry the anointing oil for the healing of Mother Earth and her children. How many people like me have been arriving in Atlanta or Georgia or Decatur? Statistics can tell us. According to Avatabra, the movement of human populations has been intensifying between countries, regions, continents, and within countries. It is not expected to stop anytime soon for various reasons. Indeed, we are informed that the Earth crisis will brew more movements as some islands sink, as many places fail to produce food due to changes in temperatures and seasons, among others. And so, I have heard that Atlanta boasts of and smells of many cuisines from various parts of the earth. I confess, since I just arrived a year ago, I haven't had enough time to indulge and taste. I have had and even visited its farmers market with foods from everywhere to cater for the various diverse populations. Bra argues that we are increasingly becoming a diasporic community living in the diaspora space where the native and the migrant find themselves within increasingly diverse cultures, regions, religions, and languages. Of course, why we travel and how we are received, how we circle, still remain predicted by one's race, class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. For theological educators, it is imperative to craft welcoming spaces. Theologies of the various cuisines in our cities, theologies of these various sounds and songs and dances and fabrics and tongues that characterize our city. The good news should be the good news that welcomes the other as part of God-created earth. The theology of diversity invites us to God's welcoming shalom, the God who created the earth and everything in it, the God who created the earth beautiful and everyone in it, the God who created the earth in goodness and connectedness and balance, the God who celebrates every part and member of creation as very good. This is the theological dream and a call. It calls for a curriculum transformation that places diversity of theological thinking at the center of its content, of its method, of its theories, of its programs. Eurocentric theological programs do not equip religious leaders of today who must serve in extremely diverse contexts. Our diasporic space calls for welcoming faith leaders. It calls for welcoming spaces that welcomes God's diverse presence. At the door of your academic halls and worship sanctuary, let us have and open these spaces of celebrating diversity. I really wanted to talk about the tall trees of Atlanta. I wanted to think about the soils of this place. I do come from a desert, so they've been amazing to me. It must be rich, fertile soil that welcomes seeds and grooms them to grow at their tallest height, often refusing these trees to be even sidelined by the human development. How beautiful are the feet of those who plant theologies of liberation and healing into this fertile soil. Welcome, Dr. Victor Aloyo, to the leadership of this theology. May God's Spirit be upon you.
Thank you, Dr. Musa Dube, for giving us the opportunity to as well challenge us to not only define questions, but refine the questions, and utilizing elements of the environment of God's good earth, Mother Earth, and recognizing that that is part of a framework that we ought to examine and explore the realities of the challenges that we experience today. I shared at this moment the fact that you mentioned that colonialization, racism, homophobia, and so many other pandemics are what we need to unmask. And we cannot be ashamed of doing so. So thank you so much. Friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Justo Gonzalez, author, theologian, and professor of church history. I am grateful for his presence here with us and among us. Dr. Gonzalez.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aloyo, and those who were sufficiently misguided to invite me to be part of this panel. I feel somewhat hindered because it's difficult for me to speak when I cannot move my hands. So I'll make my remarks half as long as they will be because I can only use one hand, for which you will be grateful. We were asked to discuss the matters before us, the conditions of theological education in the endemic area and so on, from the perspective of each of our disciplines. I find that rather restrictive because I am not very disciplined myself. But in honor and obeying the president for the time being, I will try to look at the questions from the point of view of some paradigms in church history. And as I do that, I would like to base my comments on the past in theological education of two great leaders in the history of the church. The best known, Augustine. Who doesn't know about Augustine? The second one, a bit lesser known, Ambrose, a contemporary of Augustine who actually was part in the process of conversion of Augustine and who baptized Augustine. Augustine was called, actually he was forced to become a minister after he had devoted years to theological reflection. Ambrose too was forced to become a minister, but he was not a theologian, he was a civil official. He had not paid much attention to theology. That meant that Augustine suddenly found himself having to reshape his theological interest and his theology to this pastoral task that he now had. In contrast, Ambrose, now finding himself suddenly Bishop of Milan, had to turn to one of his former teachers and call him over and say, come on and help me, give me your wisdom, your theological acuity, because I'm here at the pulpit and before the altar and I don't know what to do or what to think. Two different paths. Theology, but both leading to one result. Theology shaped by the needs of the people. Ministry shaped by good theology. Let me repeat that. Theology shaped by the needs of the people. Ministry shaped by good theology. These two patterns have persisted throughout the history of the church. For a number of reasons, the Augustinian pattern has been the most recognized, the most studied, the most followed. The Ambrosian pattern has often been relegated to the margins. We take Augustine as a paradigm. You study and then you do. And not Ambrose. Roughly at the same time as Ambrose and Augustine, there was way away in Cappadocia a very committed family, committed to the faith. One of the members of that family, known today as Basil the Great, traveled to the best schools of the area to study law. His sister, Macrina, being a woman, had to stay at home and find her own ways to learn what she learned. The name of Basil is still revered by theologians and scholars. Macrina is seldom remembered. Yet it was Macrina who opened the eyes of Basil, of the learned Basil, to his responsibilities as a Christian and turned him into a pastor and theologian. And at the end of their lives, one of their younger brothers, was talking about them. He did not call Basil, but he called Macrina the teacher. One pattern is not necessarily better than the other. Each has its own dangers. The Augustinian pattern often leads to an irrelevant theology, to a theology whose purpose is to do theology, to a theology where you think in order to publish, and you publish in order not to perish. The Ambrosian pattern often leads to the canonization of ignorance and bigotry. The Augustinian pattern may lead to that medieval theologian whom historians call known as the subtle doctor, whose subtleties were such that nobody knows what he was saying. The Ambrosian pattern may lead to another monk, a man who is now known as the mellifluous doctor, whose honeyed language was so beautiful, and whose honeyed language disagreed with anybody who did not think the same way he did, and unleashed bloody violence against Jews and Muslims and others. In general, for obvious reasons, the Augustinian pattern, with its values and its perils, has been more available to the privileged, while the Ambrosian pattern, with its perils and its values, has been more commonly available to the marginalized, to women, ethnic minorities, people what we used to call the mission field. In general, the Augustinian pattern has become the paradigmatic ideal among so-called mainline churches, while the Ambrosian pattern has become typical of ethnic minority, Pentecostal, independent, poor churches. In the mainline churches, the notion prevails that the Augustinian pattern is for us. That is for us who are mainline, not only denominationally, but also with reference to class, culture, ethnicity. And then we have the Ambrosian pattern for them, for those pastors and ethnic leaders who, they're going to be pastors, but they're going to be lay pastors. As I now look at the issues before our day today, I see a great crisis, but also a greater opportunity. Let me simply say very quickly, because I know that the time is limited, that theological education built around the Augustinian model to serve denominations that viewed that model as paradigmatic has created many institutions around the country and around the world, especially around the country right now, institutions that can no longer fill the classrooms with students from that denomination, not even with students of similar denominations. And now are filling this gap with people who have come to education following the Ambrosian pattern. Pastors who have been leading churches for years and who do not go to seminary because it is required, but because after years of experience they know that they need it. Now, we can do that because the crisis in the Augustinian pattern is also joined by a crisis among the more traditional those following the more traditional Ambrosian pattern. They are recognizing that the world is such, as Dr. Taylor was describing, the world is such that they need more of the education that is provided by those who are running the Augustinian pattern. To many traditional institutions, this seems to be the answer to the crisis. We can now fill our classrooms again. We can increase our tuition and our income in tuition. We can justify our existence, our big buildings. Perhaps we might even increase our donor base by going to these new churches. But I fear, and I hope, that the crisis and the opportunity go far beyond those issues. The crisis and the opportunity are not just institutional, not just a matter of recruitment, not just a matter of finances. They are a matter of pedagogy and of theology. For a while, institutions that were born out of the Augustinian models will be able to survive without bringing in people, as I was saying, from the Ambrosian model. If people who have been leading churches for years now need to know more about the New Testament or about theology or about church history, let them come to our courses that we offer on those subjects, and everything is fine. But as someone much better than any of us once said, you cannot put new wine into old wineskins. The new wine will break the old wineskins. A different student body with different needs, with a different church experience, will force us, those who have been more in the Augustinian model, will force us to create new courses, new bibliographies, new programs, new pedagogical methodologies, and even a new theological method, one that is consonant with the actual life of the church in all levels of societies. Will force us to go where we do not go, to those weird churches that we don't understand, to those hurting communities that we want to avoid, because it is there that we will learn what theology for today will be. Now, this will be a difficult task. It is a horrible, horrible crisis and challenge. But it is also a great opportunity. And who knows if someday Ambrose will once again baptize Augustine. Thank you.
Oh my. How inspiring and invigorating to look at a framework, right, of theological thought and pedagogical realities and pivots. That is what I'm understanding, that we need to pivot how we have done theological, pedagogical discoveries and patterns. And friends, we have at this moment gone through 4 individuals, and I'm being blown away. I am so inspired and so grateful, and I am as well encouraging those who are online, if you wish to provide questions, please feel free to do so accordingly, as we will soon be entering that time of conversation. And at this moment, I am grateful to as well welcome on the dais, on this platform, the Reverend Lyle Gwynn Garrity, Creative Director of Sanctified Art. And Lyle, welcome.
Thank you. I'm an artist, so I'm going to show some images. It truly is an honor to participate in this conversation and to be amongst the wisdom on this stage, so thank you so much for having me. My name is Lyle Gwynn Garrity. I am a 2015 dual degree graduate of CTS, and I'm the founder and creative director of A Sanctified Art. We are a collective of artists, pastors, writers, musicians, and together we create multimedia resources for worshiping communities all over the globe. We primarily create worship series with resources like poetry, liturgy, visual art, curriculum, worship art projects, devotional materials, short film. We try not to define our ministry by what we create, but instead by what we're trying to do. We use art and creativity as tools for spiritual formation. We hope to resource and support weary and overworked pastors. We try to foster collaboration on a local level because we believe that creativity begets creativity. We create visual art in order to expand imagination around images of God and around the Imago Dei, and to the best of our ability to counter the ways that white supremacy has purposefully limited our ability to see the divine in one another. We partner with guest artists, writers, and musicians to share the abundant gifts of many, and we are so honored that many of the faculty here have been guest contributors with us, Dr. Marcia Riggs, Dr. Raj Nadella, and Dr. Christine Hong. Ultimately, we are trying to invite the modern church to again become a patron of the arts and to use art for collective flourishing. Now, personally, I am an ordained minister in the PCUSA, but professionally, I exist as a bit of an institutional outlier. I'm what we call a validated minister, which I think is a very problematic term, but that's a conversation for another panel. And I serve ministry leaders in the work that I do, but I am not employed by any particular church or denomination. I was extremely fortunate and grateful to be ordained to the work of a sanctified art, which is really radical for Presbyterians. But to be completely honest, there were many parts of my ordination journey and ordination service that felt awkward and mismatched because our institution's process and language for ordination are still very much shaped around a pretty narrow vision of what it means to be a pastor. And so I often feel like an oddball in the system. I feel a little bit like an oddball on this stage, but I hope that I can provide a unique vantage point to offer something valuable to this conversation. Now, in my time at Columbia, the words that were ingrained in our collective consciousness were imagination and resilience. And while those concepts have served me well as an artist, I've been reflecting on Dr. Oloyo's vision for this new chapter in the life of CTS, one founded on the expansive grace and abundance of God. And I've been thinking about how these values might have shaped my own journey into vocational ministry as an institutional outlier. Next slide, please. First of all, I think the values of abundance and grace prompt us to let go of the structures that no longer sustain us and to pursue new models for ministry because there is an abundance of ways to live into a pastoral calling. To do this, we have to prepare leaders who are both financially literate and intentionally discovering and deconstructing their own personal money stories and theology around money. When I graduated from Columbia, I tried really hard to follow the traditional path of ministry that was laid before me and search for a call to pastor a church. But every time I read a job description, my heart would sink because pursuing a call with a capital C felt like a betrayal of my call. And as I was compelled more and more by the vision that was becoming a sanctified art, I started to realize that I would need to create a new structure. And my own money story at the time was this very binary idea that nonprofits were organizations who did good in the world, and for-profit businesses were greedy capitalists who only cared about their bottom line. However, this binary started to unravel a bit when I felt deep down that the funding structure for a sanctified art needed to be entrepreneurial. We needed the freedom to experiment and create without having to fundraise as a prerequisite. I was also concerned about power dynamics. I didn't want the source of our revenue to be deeply tied to other institutional powers who might have certain expectations and limitations. And so as we created and experimented and adapted and responded to the needs of our community, we've come to a funding model in which there is an exchange. Our patrons give us financial resources, and in return, we give them creative resources. This business structure has allowed us to grow and expand over the years so that now, as an organization, we endeavor to pay our creators equitably, and to counter the starving artist trope that is so tired, and to engage in our own financial stewardship. In the past few years, we have given away over $35,000 to 24 different organizations doing good in the world. So many of our structures in ministry are no longer sustainable. Too many nonprofits are limited by the institutional powers that give them funding. Too many churches are functioning like corporate structures with a climb-the-ladder system of pay in which the people at the bottom are compensated in ways that do not reflect the kingdom of God. Too many ministries have income streams that have dried up, which is preventing them from doing the very needed work they are called to do. And so we need to train leaders in financial literacy. Did you think that as an artist I was going to talk about money? Students should gain education around different funding models, nonprofit and for-profit structures, budgets, taxes, because those will be complicated no matter where you land. And with these practical skills, they can be taught in tandem with our theology of money, the topic that Jesus talked about all the time, to investigate our own personal stories around money, to disrupt the areas where we have scarcity, to heal where we have wounds, because those stories shape our money behaviors, and we carry those behaviors with us no matter where we go. And so through the lens of abundance and grace, how can we train leaders who are adept at reforming structures when they need to be reimagined, and who can create new structures in order to respond to the needs of the world? Secondly, next slide, please. The values of abundance and grace prompt us to train Christian leaders who are collaborators. I am really saddened by the fact that many of my peers went into ministry contexts where the culture was deeply toxic and shaped around a scarcity of grace. Too many of my peers have been deeply harmed and wounded by these experiences and have left ministry altogether. So many pastors are isolated and church staff often operate in silos, but why? Doesn't the gospel compel us to work together through webs of connection and community? Aren't we invited to see and utilize the abundance of gifts among us? We talk about it, but can we do it? At A Sanctified Art, all of our creative work is rooted in collaboration, which is beautiful and also very messy. But over the past 7 years, we've learned a lot about how to collaborate in ways that are generative and not destructive. We've gotten better at brainstorming together, inviting guests to partner with us, sharing ideas, holding our thoughts loosely without too much attachment, letting go of ego, and trying to listen collectively to the Spirit at work among us. It is holy and messy work, requiring us to both pursue clarity and also stay open to new possibilities as they emerge. Learning the skill of collaboration is deeply valuable and I think necessary no matter what ministry path you pursue. But those skills can only be honed through experience. What if seminaries had coursework that was completed through collaborative cohorts over the course of a full semester or even a year? And I'm not talking about your one-off group project. I'm proposing something more intentional. Cohorts that would be tasked with projects in which they discern a vision together and execute it together. Cohorts that would need to clarify each other's roles, learn each other's skill sets and weaknesses, practice honest and vulnerable communication, and develop workflows in order to move a concept from the idea stage into something real. Cohorts that would need time to both execute their ideas and also debrief the process, to work through conflicts and miscommunications along the way. We have to train leaders who go into churches and ministry with a heart for collaboration, who see themselves as participants in bringing forth the kingdom of God alongside their colleagues, their parishioners, and their communities. Last slide, please. Sorry, one more slide. Lastly, the values of abundance and grace prompt us to imagine expansive ways to connect, to preach and teach the gospel, and to be transformed. In our culture, we know all too well how our words can become swords. Our language is often loaded, and certain words can trigger us to close us off and shut us down. However, images are inherently expansive. The artist creates with a particular message or concept in mind, but that shifts and evolves as the work comes together. The viewer sees more than what the artist intends, and one image can speak to multiple themes and ideas. And so one of the gifts of our work at A Sanctified Art is that we can sometimes say things through our art that may not necessarily be received if they were preached from the pulpit. A few years ago, I was leading worship for a church, and throughout the service and sermon, I used this artwork titled Anointed by my colleague, Reverend Lauren Wright Pittman, who is also a CTS grad. The painting is inspired by Mary washing Jesus' feet with expensive perfume. In the worship service, I engaged the practice of Visio Divina, inviting worshipers to sit with the image, to look closely at it, to get curious about it, to imagine themselves in it, to imagine how God might be speaking to them through the art. After the service, an elderly white woman came up to me and she said, "You know, I have to admit that the whole time I was looking at the art, I didn't see the foot. I thought that it was part of the woman's hand. It wasn't until the very end of the service when you read the artist statement that I realized that it was Jesus' foot. I didn't recognize that it was Jesus' foot because I hadn't thought of Jesus as having a darker skin tone." Then she said, "I'm going to sit with that. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time." Friends, we need new ways to communicate, to connect, to see, to ways that deeply transform us from the inside out. We need leaders with the skills to reimagine and recreate the structures of ministry. We need to be collaborators, connected to the web of gifts and talents in our communities. But mostly, in a world of scarcity and fear, we need to return again and again to the expansive and abundant grace of God. Thank you.
Reverend Lyle Gwynn Garrity, thank you so much. The challenge that we have been hearing at this moment, and particularly from your testimony, is that we need to look at as well ministry beyond what has been contemplated from years past. We need to be open to entrepreneurial realities and to look at as well the fact that we are not alone, that we need to forge platforms where we create collaboration. And collaboration is critical in our day, and how we can be entrepreneurial as well and teaching the necessary disciplines so that ministers in a wide array of vocational opportunities can as well demonstrate the abundance and grace of our Lord. Thank you so much. Friends, as well, join me in welcoming Dr. Prezavia Prelo, pastor at 15th Street Presbyterian Church and director of contextual theology at Howard University School of Divinity. We welcome you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, friends and colleagues and families. Thank you so much, Dr. Loyo, and the entire Columbia community for welcoming me back home. This is a wonderful integrative opportunity to both reflect on my first arrival at Columbia Seminary and pastoring in what I call a multiplicity of pandemics. And so my comments will reflect both my journey in ministry since Columbia and what I hope to be informative remarks that will help this community imagine a response to your question: how do we form Christian leaders for an endemic era? I'll begin first with my answer to that question. In an endemic time, theological higher education should be a place where leaders are transformed to meet existing realities of change in church and society. It is my hopes that continuing theological higher education will cultivate religious leaders who can lead others, who transform communities in diverse ministry contexts through care and connected leadership praxis that navigates crisis and change while co-curating possibilities to further the Missio Dei of God from a place of transformative, redemptive hope in Jesus Christ. That's my answer to your question. As a pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, turning 181 years of ministry this month, I remind the congregants of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, a Presbyterian congregation 1 mile located away from our nation's capital and 1 mile away from Howard University, a historically black college and university. 15th Street Presbyterian Church is a predominantly African-American congregation committed to education and transformative justice. I remind the congregants time and time again that navigating, living, and being a community of faith in pandemic times, this is not our first rodeo. When the physical doors of 15th Street Presbyterian Church were closed, the doors all over the District of Columbia were closed on March 15, 2020, which happened to be the same day that I turned 40. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 began on October 1st and ended November 1, 1919. Nearly 3,000 citizens of our nation's capital died from the pandemic. During that time, the doors of 15th Street Presbyterian Church were closed. As we received the guidance from the District of Columbia that all faith communities needed to close their doors because they were, in some respects, breeding grounds for the pandemic, as a historian, pastor, theologian type person, I reminded the congregants of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, do not fear. This is not our first rodeo through a pandemic. At the time of the Spanish flu pandemic, the Reverend Francis Grimke, Presbyterian minister, pastor, and alumnus of Princeton Seminary, had pastored 15th Street Presbyterian Church for nearly 50 years. He not only pastored the congregation, but he pastored the nation. He was a prolific writer and race leader. And as I continue to walk in my own shoes, many people refer to me as a pastor of Grimke's church. So I've reflected deeply on this question of what it means to pastor a congregation living through pastoral, COVID crisis. I reflected deeply on that question and began to draw correlations 100 years before. And as a historian, pastor, theologian type person, I definitely have raised the question, have we really maneuvered change and crisis in the 100 years between the Spanish flu pandemic and the evolving pandemics of COVID, homophobia, racism, you name them. I recognize that the same struggles and realities that Reverend Francis Grimke journeyed with, I continue journeying in pastoring a congregation that, though historic, also is aging, very similar to most of the congregations across Christendom and the Presbyterian Church in particular. I imagine that I use a lot of what Columbia had attempted to form within me: resilience, creativity, imagination. 10 years ago to this very month, I actually arrived at Columbia for admissions open house. I attended an open house and met with many of the faculty whom are present in this room. I remember having a conversation with then Dean Deborah Mullen, and she and I had an interesting conversation about my interests. As a historian, I came to Columbia Seminary not to answer the call to be a Presbyterian pastor. I came to Columbia Seminary because the curriculum and the scheduling of courses seemed to dance well with my desire to not leave my tenure track position in history. But at the time, as I embarked on this journey, I had a commitment and interest in the history of Black congregations. I raised questions about how my historical sensibility could be used to advance the Missio Dei of God. I raised questions about how the teaching and preaching and writing about the history of racial injustice in our nation could better serve all of God's people and the Church Universal as we answered the question of how do we become the beloved community. During my journey at Columbia Seminary, I answered the call to become a Presbyterian pastor. And I entered into that ordination process from the vantage point of reading Gerard Wilmore's Black and Presbyterian. For me to be a leader, I had to know the context in which I was entering. So the yes to Columbia ultimately ended up in a Master's of Divinity degree conferred in 2016. It's been a 10-year journey, ebbing and flowing between the church and the academy. The landscape of my religious leadership has taken me from pastoring a small rural congregation in South Carolina to a year-long CPE residency to another degree in theology, mission, and leadership at Lutheran Seminary and pastoring a historic congregation, birthing a virtual campus that had a reformed expression of worship. Still trying to figure that out. And now currently serving as a director of contextual theology at Howard University School of Divinity. As I maneuvered all of these pathways in and out of ministry, terms like co-vocational and bivocational perhaps best describe my journey. But I am deeply aware that I have pastored a congregation and continue to live in a place of multiple pandemics. The last few years have been characterized by defining moments of ministry. I remember the day we shut the doors of our church, and the first expression of worship was on a conference call telephone line. The congregants at 15th Street and I laugh at that moment, and occasionally I listen to the video recording. But for such a time as that, that was the most accessible way that the full congregation could worship. Fast forward, Zoom became a part of our new language. And 15th Street Presbyterian Church is still worshiping virtually, although we engage in intentional expressions of hybrid gathering. Our journey is not unlike most journey of church and gathered congregations. Many of our congregations' doors are still closed, although they worship and gather virtually. When we raise the question of forming Christian leaders for an endemic era, that endemic era is now. How do we equip leaders to respond to the multiplicity of change and transition in an aging church? When I think back about these few years, which is very much a present reality, I remember the renaming of the street corner outside of the White House as Black Lives Matter Plaza. I remember standing outside with other clergy serving on the mayor's interfaith council. I remember the multiplicity of funerals of congregants that I buried and friends of congregants. Many of those funerals have been and continue to be in funeral homes because so many parishioners are still concerned about the virus. Although we no longer see ourselves in environments where most of us wear masks, fear of dying from COVID and other pandemics is still a constant reality. But an ongoing theme that brings me to my comments of how do we form Christian leaders for church and society today relates to so much of what has happened and continues to happen. The pandemic destabilized how we gathered in community. The pandemic of race and the COVID-19 pandemic challenged our traditions of the past, and it allowed us to come home to ourselves. And in coming home to ourselves, we had to address, how does our way of being continue to remain complicit with racism and other institutional practices of discrimination? So over the last 4 years, I've been busy not only pastoring and forming leaders for church and society for today and tomorrow, but I have been busy teaching and preaching on the contextual reality of race and racism in these United States of America and all across Presbyterian spaces. Whether I found myself teaching African American history to students at Bowie State University, or speaking at many think tanks across Washington, D.C., or engaging in walking tours outside with individuals wanting to understand how racially diverse churches coexisted in a community to address the question of being a beloved community. In all these contexts, we look to the past for an understanding of how to better address the racism and the pandemic of racial insensitivity in our nation's reality. All across National Capital Presbytery, so many of my white colleagues raised the questions of how could they journey alongside of Black colleagues struggling to answer the call to pastor, but also to having our own crisis of faith as we watch Black and brown bodies die because of situational reactions. So what needs to be said and what needs to be heard? Throughout this pandemic of COVID and the pandemic of race, We have had responses. Black Lives Matter has not been a term mentioned in the discourse on this panel, but it figured prominently in my pastoral leadership, in my evolving sensibility around what it means to form leaders for race and culture in society today. And partly, the history of African American Presbyterians and the answer to the question of how should the Presbyterian Church respond, not just grapple, but respond to racial injustice, and the need to be connectional across difference have abounded. There's been great interest in sitting with the history as it has shaped our current praxis, but we have not yet found answers to how we move forward in intercultural leadership. Throughout National Capital Presbytery, the gatherings of the Presbyterian Historical Society, the board of which I serve, the Reform Institute of Washington, D.C., Bowie State University, now Howard University, and certainly Columbia University, the question has been the same. How do we dialogue? How do we live? How do we become the church in the community and connected religious organizations in such a way that we answer the question of how institutional praxis shapes our ability to form Christian leaders for endemic times? How can we honor our traditions and history? And how can we make sure that our tradition and history is not a landing strip, but a launching pad? And in endemic times, here's what I believe should be said, and I hope is heard. As I mentioned last night in giving talk back to Dr. William Yu's book, What Kind of Christianity Is This? When you know better, you do better. The recent Black Lives Matter movement highlights the names of many Black and brown people who have died because of their embodied Blackness represented a threat or cause to fear, among others. It's the same conversation that can be seen in the movie currently out, Emmett Till. It's the same conversation that Billie Holiday reminds us of when she sang about strange fruit. We must revisit the enduring history of anti-Black racism and racial injustice throughout the fabric of our nation's history, and more locally, through the ways in which we have gathered in faith institutions. We must move beyond naming the injustice to responding in just ways. Secondly, to the question, what needs to be said and what needs to be heard, we must continue to live and lead from an embodied faith in the midst of uncertainty and the liminal reality of now. We must allow our faith, that is what we believe about God, and the liberating love of Jesus Christ to be the continuing moral and ethical standard by which we transform ecclesial and educational practice. Then we also too must remember and rebirth. I share with 15th Street Presbyterian Church and so many other historic Presbyterian congregations that as much as I love being a historian and a pastor and a theologian, when I sit at the session meeting, history sometimes is a troubled member among the session. Our history as historic organizations can either be our landing strip or our launching pad. We must remember that history plays a role in our present reality of forming leaders in endemic times. We must not let our historic ways and faith communities and religious institutions be our landing strip, but indeed our launching pad. In other words, some practices and beliefs and ways of gathering, and dare I say, even the curriculum, must be retired. Other practices should be laid to rest, and room must be made for transformation. What's at stake in grappling with our history? What's at stake is identity. So many congregations in our nation capital are not what they look like on the outside. And at risk is a loss of identity. But if we are to train leaders and to answer the Missio Dei of now, we have to understand that leadership requires change. So as I wrap up my comments, what approaches should seminaries explore to form impactful leaders who address the challenging questions of our times effectively? I don't really have an answer, other than to share from my embodied experience of forming lay leaders to continue to lead congregations, and now in my capacity of sitting with students discerning what ministry looks like in a time for which they don't really have an answer of where the church and ministry is going. First, I'd like to offer that theological institutions must center student spiritual formation in prayerful and spiritual disciplines that create the capacity for students and leaders preparing and leading in diverse contexts to discern. We've been in a situation of liminal space, and I have encountered time and time again colleagues feeling ill-equipped to help congregations and faith communities and religious nonprofits to discern effectively how God is calling them to lead in contexts in which they have never embraced. Students need to not only exegete a text and cultivate their capacity, they must also cultivate their capacity to discern the movement of God's Spirit. Perhaps that's not something seminaries can actually teach as much as they can model. Cultivating spiritual disciplines and lifelong learning to equip leaders through multiple transitions is an evolving call of theological higher education. A lot of the comments on this panel tonight have been spoken from a place of educating, equipping, and transforming leaders who are in degreed programs. I'm encountering in my leadership in multiple contexts throughout the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, a thirstiness for theological education among student practitioners who may never enter theological education for a full degree. So the question then becomes, how do we form Christian leaders in ways that are accessible and relatable? That brings me to a continuing need for contextual analysis, which is not a new paradigm here at Columbia Seminary. But contextual leadership and creating the capacity for leaders to think contextually is deeply shaped and informed by who is leading the contextual conversation. Action, reflection, action. Representation matters. And so, Dr. Oloyo, as you move into the presidency of Columbia Seminary, representation matters. Next, I would like to say that forming leadership, Christian leaders in endemic times requires that theological education better equip students and lifelong learners not only for leadership, but crisis leadership. We certainly can name the crises facing our churches and religious institutions and our nation's fabric. But what happens when theological education reframes itself in such a way that we respond not only ethically, but equip leaders to respond in ways that better help them to navigate crisis leadership? I buried so many people that I have stopped counting. Mostly not from COVID, but because of the blessing of longevity. But even in that, I journeyed through my own personal crisis, pastoring and caring for my mother through her own cancer journey. And it felt at times that much of what my pastoral leadership was about was preaching in such a way that encouraged the congregation and the broader DC community in a state of crisis. And I dare say that although most of our masks have come down, we are still living and leading from a place of crisis and trauma. Theological higher education must better equip students and lifelong learners to deal with the trauma of leading in changing and changed contexts. And then my Presbyterian sensibility reminds me of the importance of collaboration and connection. My saving grace throughout the pandemic and throughout my evolving sense of what it means to lead in multiple faith communities and contexts is that connection matters. I was so blessed to join so many different Lilly-funded clergy-related cohorts. So forming Christian leaders for an endemic time and an endemic age means bringing leaders together to reflect and to learn from one another and to create within them the capacity to create their own structures to learn. Leadership is sometimes isolated and happens in isolating environments. Not everyone can afford to get on a plane and come to Columbia Seminary. The technology of our time has allowed us to do just that, to collaborate. How can we form theological higher education in such a way that goes beyond the reality of being a person in the classroom, but better uses the technology that has been given to us in times of crisis? Then lastly, I will conclude by saying that forming Christian leaders for an endemic age requires courageous leadership. It requires the leaders to form their integration of authenticity, resilience, spiritual disciplines, and dare I say, emotional intelligence. When we exist as religious and faith communities to form leaders, we have to remember that the times have changed, but leaders must embody their own integrative praxis of scripture, pastoral practice, spiritual disciplines, and their capacity to lead from a place of crisis and change. I leave you with these words from the 2nd chapter of Haggai, verse 3. Who is left among you that saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Is it not in your sight as nothing? Yet now take courage. That was Sunday's sermon at 15th Street. O Zerubbabel, says the Lord. Take courage, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Take courage, all of you, people of the land, says the Lord. Work, for I am with you, says the Lord of hosts, according to the promise that I made you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit abides among you. Do not fear. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Dr. Perzavia Prelu, thank you so much for the challenge that we have received. As what I have taken away today is the fact that we are needing to recognize that the opportunities to prepare servant leaders to understand one's own trauma, to be able then to share and to serve and to minister those who are experiencing trauma on a daily basis is critical. That's what transformation is about, the transformative leadership, and that we need to be courageous, recognizing all the elements of emotional intelligence and spiritual realities as we develop our particular ministries. Thank you. And at this moment, we welcome Dr. Frank Yamada, Executive Director at the Association of Theological Schools. Dr. Yamada, thank you so much, and we welcome you.
Thank you. And now you all know what it's like to be on a panel with the last name of Y. But we've heard so much wisdom, it's hard to think of how I can add to what has been shared. Let me just say that this is really the canvas. I'm going to be speaking from my discipline of the realm of theological schools. And what is the current environment and the canvas on which these things can happen? So first, let me offer congratulations to Dr. Victor Arroyo on the eve of his inauguration as president of Columbia Theological Seminary. Victor, I was the first Asian American president to serve at PCUSA school, so I know, my brother, that you know that you are in my prayers, and my Zoom room is always open if you need to talk. You are the first Latinx president to serve at PCUSA Seminary, or at least you were the first that was announced. I believe that you and Jose began on the same day. This is a good day for PCUSA Theological Schools. Congratulations to you, Columbia Theological Seminary, on this vision and mission-driven appointment. I bring greetings from the Association of Theological Schools. I'm Frank Yamada, the 6th Executive Director of the association and the first person of color to serve in this capacity. On this panel, I bring my, thank you. But I bring my perspective about this topic, forming Christian leaders for an endemic age, from the 20,000-foot level of the industry, so to speak. It's in quotes in my text. Level of what we are seeing from the 280 member schools of the ATS. ATS schools represent the broad spectrum of theological traditions: Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, and one Jewish school. My perspective is also shaped as a former president of a PCUSA seminary, McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, where I served as its president from 2011 to 2017, and as an ordained elder in the Presbyterian Church USA, teaching elder. I think we now call it minister of word and sacrament again. We keep on changing our minds of what that actually means. Let me talk about some currents of change that we're seeing in theological schools. This, again, is a canvas of crisis and of opportunity. This is a theme that I've been hearing on our panel. I wanted to discuss 3 currents of change that will impact how Christian leaders are formed for COVID, at least in the context of formal graduate theological education. Understanding that a lot of formation of Christian leaders is happening not in these streams. Theological schools are currently undergoing dramatic changes to their business and organizational models, to their educational models, and in terms of the students that theological schools serve. I will explore how the pandemic has affected these changes, but let me make one overarching statement that applies to all 3 of these areas of change, and that is that theological schools were already undergoing significant change before the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated some of these changes. For example, the move to online delivery. There were some schools that were dragging their feet on this. That was not an option during the pandemic. In other cases, the pandemic provided a short-term window of opportunity, particularly in enrollments. I'll talk about that in just a second. In other ways, the pandemic has altered the way that we think about work and community. All things that affect educational communities and faith communities. So the first current of change is really a return of pre-pandemic trends in enrollment. So the first current of change is actually a reversion to pre-pandemic trends. During the last 3 major financial disruptions in the US, the dot-com bubble around 2000, the 2008 Great Recession, and the most recent financial disruption that was involved with the COVID-19 global pandemic, ATS schools in each of these financial disruptions actually experienced short-term 1 to 2 year bubbles of enrollment growth. In 2020, the first year of the global pandemic, ATS schools reversed an almost decade-long trend. Since 2011, about 45% of ATS schools were stable or growing, while 55% of schools were declining. In other words, for about a decade, a majority of ATS schools saw declines in enrollment. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, 55% of ATS schools saw growth or were stable in their enrollments, while 45% saw declines. This is a reversal of this trend. Now, the likely reason for these short-term bubbles of enrollment growth are likely tied to the re-evaluation of vocational aspirations among people during the financial disruptions. For example, when you lose your job or you have a change in job, you often rethink, what is my purpose and calling in life? During the Great Resignation, or for some, the Great Retirement, as in other times of financial stress, some also just went back to school. However, also similar to developments during those 2 earlier financial disruptions, enrollments during COVID are reverting back to previous trends. Early reports from ATS schools about 2021 to 2022 enrollments are already bearing this out. With just over 80% of schools reporting, 44% of schools have shown enrollment increases or enrollment stability, while 56% of schools have seen enrollment declines. This reverting back to the trend of the previous decade in which the majority of ATS schools were not growing suggests that we are heading back toward the previous trends of the previous decade. What are the implications of this? Well, I think the implications are different based on the different ecclesial families or traditions. One of the implications for mainline Protestant schools like Presbyterian Church USA schools is this. The previous decade's enrollments are returning after this 1 to 2 year bump, mainline Protestant seminaries have seen significant enrollment decline since 2005, whereas evangelical Protestant schools have been relatively stable during the last decade. This trend probably explains why we continue to see an increase in mergers and schools becoming embedded in universities and colleges, about one merger every 3 to 4 months. So while mainline Protestant schools continue to have the largest endowments in ATS schools, about 75 to 80% of the top 20 endowed schools are mainline Protestant. Their enrollments have been declining at a much higher rate than the average school. Now, just as a comparative fact or data point, of the top 20 enrollment schools in the ATS currently, all 20 are evangelical Protestant schools. So before we begin to think that there is a wave of evangelicals, I think what this actually means is we are now seeing the education of a generation of evangelicals that emerged at the end of the 20th century. Based on what we see in growth patterns in churches, I expect that they will soon see the same declines that the mainline Protestants saw at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, one takeaway for forming Christian leaders for an endemic era related to this first current of change, maybe especially for PCUSA schools, which have the largest endowments of any denominational family, is that mainline Protestant freestanding seminaries need to rethink their business and organizational models, while also thinking about which communities of faith they will serve. We are not in an era any longer, nor have we been for quite some time, where the 8 PCUSA seminaries are vying for a deep and rich national pool of Presbyterian candidates for ministry. Seminaries have become increasingly local. Seminary students are often more influenced by things like theological fit and proximity geographically than if the seminary is from a particular denomination. Many of these students are not discerning whether they should be in ministry. They are already in ministry. What does it mean for PCUSA seminaries to form and educate leaders, given that the enrollment trends are reverting back to what they were in several years prior to the pandemic? This is an important question. The second current of change is the impact on online hybrid teaching and delivery. The second current of change that emerged from the global pandemic was the adoption of online teaching and learning. So I'm just going to throw some more data at you. That's kind of what we do now at ATS. So ATS schools, like many institutions of higher education, responded to the pandemic through online teaching. Now, during the first year and a half of the pandemic, the USDE temporarily loosened requirements for online education. Those ATS schools that had already been approved to do comprehensive distance education were in better position to continue their educational missions. In fact, some of those schools experienced little disruption to their teaching and learning at all. We did have schools that had their first distance learning courses on conference calls. So what we meant by distance education meant something very different from school to school. Those other schools responded with what we would call emergency online delivery, a conference call, for example, as opposed to planned design online learning. What are some of the implications of this? Just a couple more pieces of information, too. The impact that this has had on ATS schools is profound. Even after many schools reopened their campuses and the masks have come down, most continue to offer courses online. During the pandemic, 100% of ATS schools did some form of remote distance learning. Currently, of the 262 accredited schools in the Commission on Accrediting of ATS, 243 schools are now approved for distance education, 225 for comprehensive, and 18 for limited. So almost 93% of schools are approved for distance education and 86 approved for comprehensive distance education. This is raising questions among schools around at least a few areas. For example, what does online learning mean for student formation? What does an increase in online courses mean for a school's learning community? A related question is being asked about those who work at theological schools, staff, faculty, administrators. With the emergence of the possibility of remote work, how can schools create and sustain a mission-oriented work culture, especially since almost everybody in these contexts are hardwired to think of community in terms of in-person experience? By the way, those are not the only communities that exist. Online communities have existed for quite some time, and they don't often have the same expectations that face-to-face, in-person communities have with regard to bodily presence. So one big takeaway, and also coming from communities of faith are wrestling with these same issues that theological schools are facing. A similar question is being asked in churches and for church leaders. How do we create vibrant Christian communities given the increasingly hybrid nature of faith communities? The Hartford Institute of Religion Research just released a study of the impact of COVID-19 on congregations. 80% of churches now have a hybrid worship offering with both in-person and online, while only 15% are worshiping only in person. The endemic, forming endemic leaders and endemic Christians is now. The last current that I want to discuss is the move toward what I called in my presidential address in 2011, 2040 diversity among ATS schools. This third current relates to the students that ATS schools are and will be serving. ATS schools have been becoming more diverse in terms of their students for 3 decades. Since early 1990s until now, racial, ethnic, and visa students have grown from the early 1990s from 25% of all ATS students to now 45% of all ATS students in 2021. Since 1992, white students are down 19%, Asian students are up 122%, Latinx or Latino-Latina students are up 243%, Native Indigenous students are up 69%, and visa students are up 38%. It is also clear that this increase in racial ethnic students will not be an enrollment boom for all theological schools. Schools have been adapting their curricula and faculty composition to better serve these populations, though faculty diversity has lagged way behind student demographic shifts. On this topic as well, and then this happened, Pathways for Tomorrow. In January of 2021, the Lilly Endowment launched the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative, which was designed to, quote, help theological schools strengthen and sustain their capacities to prepare and support pastoral leaders for Christian churches. This initiative had 3 phases. Phase 1 was a planning phase. 90% of ATS accredited schools received $50,000 planning grants. Phase 2, schools submitted proposals based on that planning, and a total of 105 schools received 5-year grants of up to $1 million to pursue these pathways. Of those schools, about 80% are seeking new streams of students, and about 67%, or 2/3 of those schools, are seeking to encourage and recruit students of color. Phase 3, which they just announced, stressed collaboration and cooperation with ideas and plans that could potentially reshape theological education and the ecology that supports it. 13 projects were granted up to $5 million for these collaborative projects. In total, since 2021, the Lilly Endowment has made in direct contribution to ATS schools and to the associations and ecology that support them, $209 million. That is a lot of investment in the change of theological education. How this impacts and has implications for this 2040 diversity that I was talking about in 2011. Most of the phase 2 projects have focused on future streams of enrollment. As I said before, 70% are focusing on enrollment, particularly on serving new student populations, and 2/3 of those schools are focusing on students of color. This will require schools to do adaptive work for which they do not have the muscle memory for. If they are to serve these students well, they are going to have to become learning institutions. And they're not going to have to just learn in an academic, higher education, ivory tower bubble. They are going to have to be in the communities, knowing what the communities need from their leaders. So schools are partnering with local communities, denominational judicatories, and supporting organizations more intentionally so that these students can be formed well for the leadership that the communities of faith need. Some big takeaways around this. These are shifts for which we have been waiting for a long time. However, this is also a significant adaptive challenge for schools that have not historically served communities of color well. In fact, have harmed communities of color. Moreover, I don't think that we're going to see an overall increase in enrollments that will sustain North American theological schools for the long term. These are absolutely where the mid-21st century student trends are heading in North America, but it will be a crowded educational space with many offerings from an increasing number of schools. This is the big picture canvas on which you can paint these futures. I wanted to add just a couple of things related to what theological schools do well, and that is to think theologically. Let's take a look at some of these questions. How do we understand Christian community in an endemic world? When it is an increasingly hybrid, and yet most of us are wired to be in person. And yet there is this expectation and demand for offerings to be more flexible and online. It's both and all of the above. How do we understand Christian community in an endemic world as we shift to a time when theological students and communities reflect better the diversity for which many of us had hoped at the turn of the millennia? A time when there will no longer be racial ethnic majority, and yet the pandemics continue. Even when racism and American Eurocentrism persist in our institutional structures, curricula, and ways of being in community, how can theological education institutions change to serve better these students? How can schools form faithful and adaptive leaders who can lead congregations into these same changes that congregations are facing, so that the communities of faith can be faithful witnesses in an increasingly polarized U.S. context? Second theological reflection thought: how do we reshape the patterns of Christian formation and the formation of leaders to learn in increasingly hybrid learning communities, to serve in increasingly hybrid communities, to address the changing nature of communities of faith with things like adaptive leadership and change leadership, and not leadership that is geared toward establishing and sustaining the status quo of what congregations were, but of who they want to become. One last footnote. As you can tell from my comments, none of these things and changes happen in a vacuum. But all of this is happening during a tsunami of leadership transitions. It's typical in our ATS online newsletter, which you are more than willing to subscribe to. In our summer issue, we would often give a listing of the new presidents and deans that we're serving in ATS schools. In a typical year, we could usually write a paragraph or a few sentences for each of the new presidents and deans that we're serving, because it was usually about a dozen or 24 at the most. In 2021, 100 new CEOs or executives and CAOs, chief academic officers or academic deans, were called at 84 ATS schools. In 2022, the third year of the pandemic, 83 new presidents or executive deans and academic deans at 74 ATS schools were called to service. That is a lot of change. To say that the COVID-19 global pandemic has accelerated in change in theological schools is an understatement. Within these currents of change, there are several opportunities and challenges for theological schools, but that is part of the rich tradition of theological schools, indeed of our very faith. It is in times of crisis and change where God's church and theological schools are often the most creative. This is the time to which you have been called, my friend Victor. Know that all of the resources at ATS are at your disposal and the disposal of this school so that you can imagine what these futures need to be. Thank you.
Dr. Yamada, thank you so much for painting that canvas and providing us with that information, and more importantly, for the opportunity of the partnerships that have been developed and for the commitment of ATS to support theological institutions across the land to be more innovative and bold and to not only ask questions but refine questions and be able to move forward accordingly. So thank you so much. Friends, in the interest of time, we have heard a wealth of information which is critical as Columbia Theological Seminary, as one of the many within the Theological Academy, are wrestling with pertinent questions. As we lead the church in recognizing these particular dynamics and that are impacted by socioeconomic, political, religious variables that we confront. We understand that as well the journey is long. It is going to be an opportunity by which we take incremental steps and that we prioritize accordingly. In the interest of time, friends, I was going to have an opportunity to ask a question to our panelists, but since they've responded to an initial question that I've posed, I'm going to ask at this moment if there are questions from the floor. What I would, in the interest of time, suggest is that we have two questions. And so if there's someone, I see someone already there in the back, and so if we can get a microphone to him, thank you so much. But as we're getting a microphone, friends, can you join me in thanking our panelists for, yes. We have a question in the back.
All right. I'm a third-year dual degree student here at CTS. I'm very grateful for the wealth of wisdom and thoughts shared tonight. It really does give me inspiration and encouragement with in whose hands theological education is going to be shaped in the coming years. I want to maybe focus a little bit on those being shaped right now. And we've talked a lot about all of the challenges coming ahead. Won't go over all of them, but climate crisis, the rise of right-wing fascism across the globe, economic instability, etc. This is the context that we are moving into. I also want to highlight, not to overclaim the uniqueness, but where this generation of students is distinct from other generations of students, especially here at Columbia in the past 100 years or so, especially as it relates to a lack of resources and a lack of stability and the challenges of the calls that we are moving into. So I would say my question is in two parts. One is, what can theological institutions do outside of the classroom to help students with their lives outside of the classroom? Because the amount of energy that goes into the classroom, the amount of energy we spend outside the classroom, it all comes from the same source. And I know I have had many conversations with other students where we talk about how we do not have as much energy to do as much as we would like to in our theological education and training. And then the second part is that I do feel, given the context of these trends which are coming to a head, these various crises, there is either an implicit or explicit statement of investment of hope in the current generation of students. And we are Christians. I think hope is something we should do and do well. But I want to say, while I think theological institutions are good at investing hope in students, do theological institutions, the institutions themselves, not just individual faculty or administration, etc., do they also know how to lament what is lamentable about what students have come from, what students are experiencing now, where we are moving into and being called to, and what we're being asked to carry? And if so, what does that look like?
So, okay, so Dr. Musa Dube will take the second question. Who would like to take the first question? Oh, you want them to take the second as well? Who wishes to? Okay.
I'll grapple with the first question.
Okay.
One of my deep passion and interests of late has been journeying with leaders in places of spiritual formation and contemplative praxis. And so to answer the question of how to create a life of leadership, service, and witness, for lack of better words, beyond the formal academic space, leadership begins now, even in the curriculum and experience of being a student. So much of what you learn in seminary are pathways and foundations for leadership beyond the classroom. But it's the same in being a pastor or ordained leader or serving in nonprofits. What is the ebb and flow between what you do? It's the relationship between being and doing. So you have to cultivate the sensibility of being so that you can do and that you don't experience burnout. And so the lesson learned in having pastored is that my journey has been a lot of doing, but I'm in a season of my leadership where I'm focusing on being. And isn't the being in the presence of God that first reminds me that I'm a child of God and that in my own energy, in my own strength, I don't have answers to the multiplicity of pandemics and challenge and change that I'm currently trying to lead and form others to lead in as I'm doing myself. But I find that cultivating a lifelong journey of your rule for life, your journey of what spiritual fortitude looks like for you as a leader is vitally important. And although a professor cannot necessarily teach you that in a classroom, the broader sense and mission of theological higher education can certainly form and frame that so that you have a pathway beyond the being of leadership so that you can actually do from a place of embodied witness.
How do we travel with students to understand where they are from and where they need to go? In my classroom space, I often use storytelling and social location. I would like always to begin with my own story and to use my life and my interaction with the world and education through storytelling. In so doing, invite students to look into their own social location. As a biblical scholar, I often say, before we even read the text, let us read ourselves. Who are you? You know, what is your gender? What is your class? What is your race? You know, what is your ethnicity? How have those things formed you? How do they inform where you want to go and how you read the text? And how do they also inform how you interact with the world and the other? So in a small way, opening the space of the classroom to be a space of storytelling, to be a space of, entering into each other's, worldviews and social locations in order to prophesy to each other. In the HIV/AIDS context, one of the challenges that happened to me as I was teaching was to recognize that it wasn't enough for me to just dialogue with fellow scholars, to read just books, but to extend the classroom into the community, and the challenges that the communities are facing. So we started wanting to know what are the theologies that are rising from the community concerning the pandemic, and how we can take that into consideration in our learning. So the learning space became expanded beyond the classroom, the academic classroom, in the academic halls, to the communities themselves, traveling with their voices, with their thinking, with their challenges, and reshaping our own thinking, how we need to move into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question. Yes, please. We need a microphone. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank y'all so much for being here. Really quickly, how have the words that you have spoken tonight changed your syllabus or show up in the syllabus that you create? And how do you encourage your colleagues in the words that you have spoken, or challenge them in some instances to move their syllabi along?
I'll start, but I'm surrounded by scholars who are thinking about this too, so I'll just say a couple of things briefly, which is one of my great frustrations is that registration for my classes happens after my syllabus needs to be turned in. And there are good reasons for that, but the cost is that I can't reframe syllabus and the readings to be responsive to the particular constituency that is my class at that point. An example of this year, typically in a class that I teach regularly, I've had a number of Korean and Korean American students. So I included several readings from Korean and Korean American students. I included a couple from African scholars. My class has no Korean or Korean American students and has 5, 6 African students in it. They get a smattering. But if I could have reframed it and had the syllabus done after registration happens, I would have changed the syllabus and the readings along the way. That's just kind of a starting point for one thing with regard to the syllabus that I try to do that I wish we could do better.
A lot. I mean, for us, HIV/AIDS and the fact that it placed African communities and women at the center of the storm was a huge call to curriculum transformation and reimagining what we teach and how we teach it, and as well as retraining both the church leaders and the theological trainers themselves. So that was a huge movement that involved the whole continent and also involved our research. We took it especially in particular in the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians to center HIV/AIDS as our research and into the curriculum, books, produce books as well. 2019, and when I say we, I'm speaking of the Circle of Concerned of African Women Theologians. Again, we began to center the theme of the earth, you know, Mother Earth, Mother Africa, and faith. And we've been researching on that, publishing on that, you know, as continent-wide African women theologians, and taking that to the class. So very much a big movement to really travel with our context and bring our context into the classroom so that the students who graduate from our seminaries and our universities is equipped, to deal with the context where they're going to serve, the communities that they're going to serve, and the challenges that they're facing.
My most important teaching mentor is Bell Hooks and her book, Teaching to Transgress. And one of the things that she has taught me, and I must recognize that I am in a stage in my professional vocational journey in which I can do this, and administrators will not bother me. I do recognize that. And that is, the syllabus is simply a guiding template. I will change the course depending on the needs of the student. I'll change readings, but there's a power asymmetry that I do recognize. It is not the same thing to be an assistant professor and do that. The dean can get mad with you. But once you finish that Augustine model that Justo was talking about, then you can move to the Ambrose model. But Bell Hooks has been the most important mentor in letting me know that the classroom is not the syllabus. The classroom is full of human beings interacting with their context, and I need to respond to that. Thank you.
I just wanted to share real briefly, a lot of the comments I have made is situated in creating integrative places where students can do the action, reflection, action. And so I'm making a plug for field education and education beyond the classroom. And so I think theological education has to reimagine the whole discourse around field education in this endemic time. What is the field into which we are forming leaders for, number one. And so at Howard Divinity, and because that's the place where I'm charged with working right now, field education looks very differently in this time. It's definitely modeled from a place of forming leaders in such a way that they can raise questions around the justice of God and what it looks like beyond the theological education environment. In addition, reclaiming formation of leaders in contexts that I think we take for granted. What does it mean to send students to engage clinical pastoral care in a homeless shelter? What does it mean to send students to the halls of government to think theologically around what is happening? What does it mean to send students to do not just exegete biblical text, but to exegete a neighborhood while voting is happening? So really to reframe where the practice of ministry and where students are observing ministry is happening. But then lastly, I also offer the ways in which we think about lifelong learning has to change. Many people, regardless of, it's not just about age and stage, but regardless of where they are on their journey, they're looking to think about how can they live a life of meaning in this changed, disembodied, liminal, however you want to describe it, world. So when we think about continuing education, the same questions that we're asking of degreed programs are the same questions we need to ask of lifelong learning. How can we create educational experiences such that people encounter God, but they're transformed to change and to lead in this context?
Friends, once again, please join me in appreciating the time, the efforts, the energies, and the responses of our panelists. Grateful for this time. Thank you for, as well, your participation within these inaugural events. Please, you are all cordially invited for tomorrow's events at 3 o'clock at the Decatur Presbyterian Church, and it will be an honor to see you all so that we can celebrate together the new chapter, not only of Columbia Theological Seminary, but also of this servant's ministry. May you all rest well. Blessings to you all. Bendiciones.